It's about time we looked at something really good, and in these early days of the Famicom and NES, mostly consisting of mediocre or really ancient arcade games, even though there's nothing wrong with them, I'm glad we finally get to one of the best early games for the NES, Kung Fu. The proto beat-em-up Kung Fu released on launch for the American NES, and alongside Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, and Excite Bike would leave the biggest impact in the NES library as some of the most popular titles released. So where do we start on this one? Well, how about in the beginning? With a company called IREM. IREM was an arcade developer which one of their employees, Takashi Nishiyama, had essentially created a brand new genre called the beat 'em up, based on the Bruce Lee movie The Game of Death. It involved your main character walking and defeating enemies as he moved, essentially evolving the fighting genre into more adventurous experiences. During development, IREM got the licensing right to make the game based off a movie called Wheels on Meals. A kung fu comedy movie starring Jackie Chan, Yuen Baio, if I can pronounce that right, and a few other actors and actresses you probably never heard of. It's about two cousins, Thomas and David, living in Barcelona, making a living serving food from their food truck, and eventually getting entangled with a con artist, Sylvia. How much does this game relate to Meals on Wheels? Would you believe? Barely. Just Thomas and Sylvia are the only thing taken from the movie, and here they're not even represented right. In game, they're a couple, but in the movie, it's Thomas's cousin David who wants her more than him. As said before, this game has more to do with Bruce Lee's The Game of Death, notable for being the last film Lee was recording before his early tragic death. But the movie has Lee's character taking down several foes in a 5-story pagoda, one of which was 70s and 80s basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. No, I'm not kidding. Meals on Wheels was released in Japan under the more badass and unrelated title Spartan X, which is what the game was known in Japan, and was eventually brought over to America under the more generic title of Kung Fu Master. Although IREM would later make games to the Famicom, this port was actually done by another company, Nintendo themselves, and a rare sight of them porting another developer's game, and doing a fantastic job while they're at it. The game has you control Thomas, who must save his girlfriend, Sylvia, from the evil Mr. X, but Thomas must prove his worth, taking down 4 of his right side men, as well as several uninspiring mooks, whose greatest threat consists of hugging you to death. But not every floor is the same. Some can have more threats that are about dodging or hitting at the correct time, like these snakes, moths, and dragons. Yeah, apparently Mr. X knows where to find those. Thomas controls pretty much like the main character in Yi Kung Fu. You have a punch, a kick, and a jump by pressing up on the D-pad. But here it definitely feels a lot more polished. Hitting an enemy actually connects a lot better. So what makes this game so special? What's worth coming back 30 years later compared to later beat-em-ups like Final Fight or Streets of Rage? Well, I think I know the secret, and that's defeating enemies in one punch or kick feels satisfying. It feels like you're this all-powerful kung fu master, so to speak, taking down everything in your path. And because you're defeating everything quickly, you can get a move on quickly to sort of see how fast you can get through the game once you finally master it, so it has a bit of appeal to the speedrunning crowd. And if you defeat most enemies in 1 or 2 punches, that technically makes you stronger than Mike Hagar. Even though he punches punks rampantly, they still get up. But here, no, they fly off screen. But maybe I'm looking too deep into that. I mean, these guys' main form of attack is hugging you until you die. Another big appeal, at least at the time, is how big the enemy roll call is compared to every action-based game on the Famicom so far. Not counting shoot-em-ups, every game so far had 1 or 2 basic enemies. Kung Fu has 3 basic enemies, 3 enemies special to certain stages, and 5 different boss fights. Yes, all these boss fights are completely different from one another, and these fights don't feel like basic button mashers. Dodging and countering is involved. But I do have something to say on the 4th boss, this guy who controls moths. At first this guy never seems to go down. You punch his head off, but then he reappear unharmed and launch a moth at you, which if it hits you, drains a good bit of health. I had such a hard time with this boss at first, I thought it was almost impossible. Until I discovered his weak spot. Just spam your duck punch until he dies. Look, anyone could have a hard time figuring that out. Also have noticed the attack power of the other creatures you fight. Why is a snake doing that much damage? Why is a moth? I can get a dragon doing serious damage, I mean it's breathing fire, but why is it underling humans of Mr. X, Master Kidnapper, and Deadly Kung Fu Artist do diddly squat compared to a gardener's snake? I'd say Kung Fu is a hard game to any beginner, but after a bit of playing, you'll get the hang of things. I was able to beat all 5 stages with only losing 1 life. Ironically, Mr. X is not really that hard, but he does recover health if you don't constantly hurt him. After that, you get a cutscene of you and Sylvia reconnecting, but this game continues from the beginning, only harder, much like every other arcade NES game. Compared to the arcade Kung Fu Master, I'd say Kung Fu is easily the better game. Sure, the graphics aren't as good, but the gameplay's faster, less ambush of the enemies, and you can push enemies off just by punching them instead of shaking them off. Amazing that a low processor can accomplish much more. Kung Fu is considered an NES classic in America, but in Japan it has a much greater reputation, considered like top 10 material. In a 2006 reader poll for FamiThon, a Japanese gaming magazine, it was ranked among the top 100 games of all time, even beating out Super Mario Bros. 3 on that list. Super Mario Bros. 3! I love Kung Fu, but maybe not that much. I want to assume this has something to do with the movie it's based on, but I have no clue on how big of a hit that was in Japan. But at the very least, at this point in the Famicom releases, Kung Fu definitely takes a spot of my favorite NES game. But we still got hundreds more games to play.
Huh? The alarm.
Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick.